Gilded Age power mansions were not merely homes. They were deliberate instruments of wealth, authority, and social engineering. Rising from the fortunes of railroads, steel, oil, and finance in the late 19th century, these monumental residences transformed American cities and resort towns into stages of unprecedented opulence. Clad in marble, crowned with gilded ceilings, and staffed by armies of servants, they announced the arrival of a new ruling class determined to rival and surpass the aristocracies of Europe. Behind their ornate facades lay carefully orchestrated worlds where architecture, technology, and social ritual converged to manufacture power. Every ballroom, library, and dining room served a strategic purpose, reinforcing hierarchies, forging alliances, and shaping political and economic outcomes far from public view. These mansions functioned as private capitals, where industrial titans converted raw wealth into cultural legitimacy and social dominance. Yet the grandeur of these estates also exposed the tensions of their age. Celebrated as triumphs of progress and craftsmanship, they simultaneously became lightning rods for criticism, symbolizing inequality in an era of labor unrest and reform. Their rapid rise and equally swift decline reveal a paradox at the heart of the Gilded Age. Immense ambition built for permanence in a society undergoing constant change. To study these power mansions is to understand how architecture became a language of authority, and how excess ultimately reshaped the American landscape. Gilded Age mansions were never conceived as private retreats in the modern sense. They were calculated expressions of authority, designed to convert unprecedented industrial wealth into visible, unquestionable power. In an era when American elites lacked inherited titles or centuries-old lineages, architecture became the most immediate and persuasive language of legitimacy. A mansion was not simply a home, it was a declaration of arrival, a territorial marker announcing who controlled capital, influence, and social space. Scale was the first and most obvious instrument of power. These residences dwarfed anything previously associated with domestic life in America. Mansions such as the Breakers in Newport or the Vanderbilt houses on Fifth Avenue were intentionally oversized, overwhelming the human figure and asserting dominance through sheer mass. Grandeur was meant to intimidate as much as to impress. Approaching these buildings, often set back behind gates, terraces, or long carriage drives, was a carefully choreographed experience that reinforced hierarchy before a guest ever crossed the threshold. Location amplified this message. Power mansions occupied the most strategically visible or socially significant ground: Fifth Avenue, Bellevue Avenue, Commonwealth Avenue, or commanding coastal cliffs. These addresses functioned as elite enclaves, where proximity to other powerful families reinforced collective authority. To build among them was to claim membership. To be excluded was to remain socially invisible. Real estate, in this context, became a form of social legislation. Internally, the mansion operated as a stage for power performance. Public rooms, ballrooms, grand dining rooms, galleries, and libraries were designed for hosting, not comfort. Their dimensions reflected crowd control, circulation, and spectacle. A dinner for 20 required architectural choreography. Procession from entrance hall to drawing room to dining room, all under ceilings painted with allegories of empire, commerce, and classical virtue. These interiors communicated refinement and permanence, suggesting that industrial wealth was not vulgar or temporary, but destined to endure. The mansion also formalized social hierarchy through spatial segregation. Owners occupied the most prominent rooms. Guests were guided through prescribed routes. Servants moved invisibly through back staircases and hidden corridors. Power was embedded in the plan itself. To know where one could stand, walk, or speak was to understand one's rank within the household's micro-society. Architecture enforced obedience without words. Importantly, these estates functioned as private capitals. Decisions affecting railroads, banks, political alliances, and philanthropic institutions were often made in libraries and smoking rooms rather than boardrooms. Hosting conferred leverage. A dinner invitation could signal approval. Exclusion could end a career. The mansion thus became a soft power instrument, shaping outcomes through access rather than force. Yet this architectural power carried risk. By making wealth visible on such a colossal scale, these mansions also invited scrutiny. Journalists, reformers, and the public read them as symbols of excess and inequality. What had been intended as monuments to permanence increasingly appeared as provocations. In this tension lies the paradox of the Gilded Age power mansion. It was designed to legitimize authority, yet it also helped expose the fragility of that authority in a rapidly changing democratic society. Ultimately, these mansions reveal how power sought to materialize itself in stone, marble, and gold. They stand as evidence that in the Gilded Age, architecture was not passive decoration. It was strategy. The monumental scale and opulence of Gilded Age mansions were inseparable from the industrial systems that financed them. Every carved cornice, imported tapestry, and gilded ceiling was the physical residue of rail lines laid, furnaces fired, oil wells drilled, and financial instruments engineered at a scale previously unknown in American history. These mansions were not abstract symbols of wealth. They were direct architectural translations of industrial power. Railroads produced the most visible and aggressive mansion builders. Families such as the Vanderbilts converted logistical empires into architectural ones, using their homes to mirror the reach and dominance of their transportation networks. The linear logic of rail expansion, control of routes, terminals, and choke points, was echoed in the commanding siting and axial planning of their estates. Their mansions projected inevitability. Just as railroads structured the nation's movement, the families who owned them structured its hierarchy. Steel fortunes expressed themselves differently. Andrew Carnegie's wealth, forged through vertical integration and relentless efficiency, funded residences that emphasized cultural authority over flamboyance. While still lavish, steel money often favored libraries, music rooms, and art collections, spaces that implied intellectual stewardship rather than raw display. This was strategic. Industrialists whose fortunes depended on labor-intensive production sought to temper public perception by aligning themselves with education, philanthropy, and progress. Oil wealth, exemplified by the Rockefellers, produced yet another architectural language. Rooted in extraction and consolidation, oil fortunes emphasized control, insulation, and long-term dominance. Their residences often projected restraint externally while maintaining extreme luxury within. This duality reflected a keen awareness of public hostility toward monopolies. The mansion became a controlled environment where wealth could be enjoyed privately while appearing morally disciplined. Financial and banking dynasties, J.P. Morgan, foremost among them, used mansions as instruments of cultural arbitration. Their wealth was less visible to the public than factories or railroads, making architecture a crucial tool for establishing legitimacy. These homes were filled with rare manuscripts, ancient sculptures, and European masterworks, positioning their owners as guardians of civilization rather than manipulators of markets. The message was clear. Financial power was not predatory, but custodial. Importantly, these industrial fortunes shaped not only what was built, but how quickly. The speed at which vast mansions rose, sometimes completed in only a few years, mirrored the accelerated accumulation of capital itself. This compression of time contributed to their excess. Wealth that had taken centuries to accumulate in Europe was condensed into a single American lifetime, and architecture struggled to absorb it gracefully. The mansion also served as a stabilizing counterweight to volatile industries. Industrial capitalism was cyclical, subject to crashes, strikes, and regulatory threats. A stone-built estate suggested permanence in a system defined by disruption. By anchoring wealth in land, art, and architecture, industrialists sought to transform liquid capital into enduring legacy. Yet the connection between industry and mansion was never neutral. These homes were built atop labor disputes, environmental transformation, and economic inequality. The same systems that enabled unprecedented luxury also generated unrest, making the mansion both a triumph and a liability. Its grandeur testified to success, but its visibility made it a target for critique. To read a Gilded Age mansion correctly, one must look beyond its style and into its balance sheet. Each facade conceals a specific industrial story of consolidation, innovation, exploitation, and ambition. Together, these houses form a built archive of American capitalism at its most confident and most controversial. Among the elite families of the Gilded Age, architecture became a competitive sport. Mansions were not merely statements of taste or comfort, they were deliberate responses to the houses of rivals. Each new commission sought to surpass what had come before, in size, cost, stylistic authority, or technological sophistication. This escalating cycle of comparison and excess produced some of the most ambitious domestic architecture ever constructed in the United States. One-upmanship began with scale. When one family built large, another built larger. Square footage, ceiling height, frontage, and the number of reception rooms became quantifiable measures of dominance. A ballroom capable of hosting 400 guests was no longer exceptional once a neighbor commissioned one for 600. This logic pushed domestic architecture beyond any functional requirement, transforming homes into monuments designed for spectacle rather than habitation. Style was the next battlefield. Families aligned themselves with European traditions that best suited their desired image. French Renaissance chateaux suggested aristocratic lineage and royal authority. Italian Renaissance palazzi implied humanist refinement and mercantile power. English country house styles conveyed stability and inherited tradition. The choice of style was rarely accidental. It functioned as visual rhetoric, positioning the owner within a specific cultural hierarchy. When a rival adopted one idiom, another often responded with something more historically prestigious or archaeologically precise. This rivalry fueled an obsession with authenticity. Stone was quarried from Europe, antique fireplaces were dismantled and shipped across the Atlantic, and entire rooms were imported wholesale. Accuracy became a weapon. A staircase copied from a French chateau could be dismissed as vulgar imitation. A staircase built with original 16th century components could not. The mansion thus became an argument, asserting not only wealth but cultural literacy. Architects played a central role in this competitive escalation. Firms such as Richard Morris Hunt and McKim, Mead and White were acutely aware of their clients' social positioning. They designed not in isolation, but in dialogue with nearby projects, responding to rival commissions almost in real time. A facade was adjusted, a cornice raised, a ballroom enlarged, all to ensure that no neighboring house could claim architectural superiority. Interior spaces reflected the same competitive impulse. Dining rooms grew more theatrical, libraries more solemn, entrance halls more cathedral-like. Decoration intensified as well, deeper gilding, rarer marbles, more elaborate ceiling paintings. The goal was to overwhelm guests with an accumulation of impressions, leaving no doubt as to where power resided. To be impressed was to be subordinated. Technological innovation also became a site of rivalry. Early adopters of electricity, elevators, or advanced heating systems advertised their modernity as aggressively as their historicism. A house that combined medieval aesthetics with cutting-edge infrastructure signaled total command over both past and future. Comfort itself became competitive, with rival hosts seeking to outdo one another in seamless luxury. This architectural arms race had consequences. Costs ballooned, timelines extended, and maintenance demands became extreme. Some families bankrupted themselves attempting to keep pace. Others found their triumphs short-lived, as newer, larger, or more fashionable houses rendered theirs obsolete within a decade. The very logic of one-upmanship ensured instability. Yet the legacy of this rivalry is extraordinary. Freed from restraint and fueled by competition, architects and patrons pushed domestic architecture to its limits. The resulting mansions represent not moderation, but ambition unchecked. Houses built to win social contests rather than to endure quietly. In the end, architectural one-upmanship reveals a central truth of the Gilded Age. Power was relational. It existed not in isolation, but in comparison. These mansions were built to be seen next to one another, each asserting supremacy in a crowded landscape of wealth, ambition, and anxiety. One of the most revealing aspects of Gilded Age power mansions is how little of them was truly American in origin. While the fortunes that funded these houses were generated through distinctly American industries, the cultural authority they aspired to project was overwhelmingly European. Imported craftsmanship became the bridge between new money and old legitimacy, allowing industrial elites to cloak themselves in the material language of aristocracy. At the highest levels of wealth, it was no longer sufficient to commission European-style work from American artisans. Authenticity demanded origin. Stone carvers in Italy, woodworkers in France, metalworkers in Austria, and tapestry makers in Belgium were employed to produce architectural elements that were then shipped across the Atlantic. Mantels, paneling, ceilings, staircases, and even entire rooms were fabricated abroad, numbered, packed, and reassembled inside American mansions with archaeological precision. France in particular held immense symbolic power. French craftsmanship was associated with royal patronage, academic rigor, and refined taste. To install a boiserie carved in Paris or a ceiling painted by a French atelier was to import not just an object, but a lineage. These interiors quietly asserted that their owners belonged to a continuum of power stretching back to European courts, despite their wealth being only a generation old. Italy supplied a different kind of authority. Marble from Carrara, stone carvers trained in Renaissance traditions, and sculptors versed in classical form brought gravitas and permanence. Italian craftsmanship linked American industrialists to Rome, Florence, and Venice, centers of historical empire, commerce, and art. A marble staircase was never merely decorative. It was an allusion to civilization itself. The logistics of this transatlantic craftsmanship were staggering. Entire workshops were contracted overseas to work exclusively on American commissions. Designs were approved through correspondence and travel, with architects acting as cultural translators between patrons and artisans. Delays, damage, and miscommunication were common, yet the expense and complexity only heightened the prestige. Difficulty became part of the value. This imported labor also reshaped the role of American architects. Rather than designing every detail, they became curators and coordinators, assembling a global network of crafts into a coherent whole. The mansion functioned as a museum of applied arts, where each room represented a different historical period or national tradition. Walking through such a house was meant to feel like moving through centuries of European culture, compressed into a single estate. Yet this dependence on European craftsmanship revealed an underlying insecurity. American wealth was confident in its economic power, but uncertain of its cultural standing. By importing artisans rather than cultivating them, elites implicitly acknowledged that refinement could not yet be fully manufactured at home. The mansion thus became both a triumph and a confession. There were also political implications. At a time when immigration, labor rights, and national identity were fiercely debated, these houses celebrated foreign skill while often marginalizing local labor. The contrast between imported luxury and domestic industrial hardship did not go unnoticed by critics. To some observers, these mansions looked less like achievements and more like withdrawals from American civic life. Despite this tension, the results were extraordinary. Few periods in American history produced interiors of such technical mastery and artistic ambition. The survival of these rooms, now preserved in museums and historic houses, offers rare insight into a moment when wealth sought legitimacy through craftsmanship rather than innovation. Imported European craftsmanship, ultimately, was not about imitation. It was about acquisition. By purchasing the material remnants of aristocratic culture, Gilded Age elites attempted to buy time, to compress centuries of tradition into a single generation. Their mansions stand as evidence of both the success and the limits of that strategy. The Gilded Age mansion was not the product of wealth alone. It was the result of a strategic alliance between industrialists and a new class of elite architects. These architects were not merely designers, but cultural intermediaries, capable of translating raw capital into social authority. In a society where money arrived faster than tradition, architects became essential partners in the manufacture of legitimacy. Industrialists required more than technical competence. They sought architects who understood hierarchy, symbolism, and the unspoken codes of elite society. Figures such as Richard Morris Hunt, Stanford White, and the firm of McKim, Mead & White rose to prominence precisely because they could navigate both artistic and social worlds. Many had trained at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, giving them not only technical skills but institutional credibility rooted in European academic tradition. This shared language of prestige allowed architects to act as advisors rather than servants. They guided clients towards styles, materials, and spatial arrangements that would best support their desired public image. A newly wealthy railroad magnate might be steered toward French Renaissance grandeur to imply dynastic ambition, while a financier might be counseled to adopt a more restrained Italian palazzo to suggest stability and control. Architecture became a curated identity. The alliance was mutually reinforcing. Architects gained access to unprecedented budgets and creative freedom, while industrialists gained cultural cover. Unlike speculative developers, these patrons were willing to fund experimental scale, imported materials, and labor-intensive craftsmanship. Failure was unacceptable, but excess was encouraged. This environment pushed American architecture to new levels of ambition and technical sophistication. Personal relationships deepened the alliance. Architects often became confidants, frequent guests, and even power brokers within elite circles. Their recommendations influenced not only buildings but social networks, art acquisitions, and even philanthropic projects. To choose an architect was to choose a worldview, and by extension, a social trajectory. This concentration of power also reshaped the profession itself. Architecture shifted from a trade to a cultural authority. Signature architects emerged, and their names alone carried social weight. Hiring a prominent architect was a declaration of seriousness. It signaled that a family intended to endure rather than merely enjoy its wealth. In this sense, architects became brand builders long before the concept existed. However, the alliance carried risks. Architects, eager to satisfy competitive patrons, sometimes encouraged excess beyond sustainability. Maintenance costs soared, designs grew increasingly elaborate, and practical concerns were subordinated to spectacle. When fortunes declined or tastes shifted, these same buildings became liabilities rather than assets. Critics of the era recognized this dynamic. Reformers accused architects of enabling inequality by aestheticizing excess. To them, these professionals were complicit in disguising exploitation beneath marble and gold. The architect-industrialist alliance thus became a focal point in broader debates about the moral responsibilities of art and wealth. Despite this criticism, the partnership left a lasting legacy. The mansions produced during this period established standards of craftsmanship, urban presence, and spatial drama that continue to influence American architecture. They also set a precedent for how wealth collaborates with creative authority, a pattern still visible in today's relationships between billionaires and star architects. Ultimately, the Gilded Age architect was not just a designer of buildings, but an engineer of power. Through their alliance with industrialists, architecture became a disciplined, strategic force, capable of shaping perception, hierarchy, and history itself. Beneath the marble floors and gilded ceilings of Gilded Age power mansions lay an invisible world of technology that was as advanced as the architecture above it was historic. While these houses projected old-world grandeur, they were simultaneously among the most technologically sophisticated environments of their time. Luxury for the elite was not only about appearance, it was about control, efficiency, and insulation from inconvenience. Electricity was one of the most potent symbols of modern power. At a time when most American households still relied on gas or candlelight, Gilded Age mansions were wired for electric illumination, often with private generators housed in basement power rooms. Light fixtures were designed to resemble candles or oil lamps, deliberately disguising the technology to preserve historical aesthetics. The message was subtle but unmistakable. The owner could command the future without appearing dependent on it. Heating systems further reinforced this control. Central heating, often powered by massive coal-fired boilers, allowed for consistent indoor climates regardless of season. Radiators were concealed behind decorative grills or integrated into furniture, maintaining visual harmony while ensuring comfort. In some houses, different wings could be heated independently, allowing owners to occupy selective zones while the rest of the mansion remained dormant, a spatial expression of authority over environment itself. Plumbing represented another quiet revolution. Multiple bathrooms, hot and cold running water, and advanced drainage systems were rare luxuries even for the affluent. In power mansions, they were expected. Servants' bathrooms were segregated and utilitarian, while family and guest baths featured marble, porcelain, and custom metalwork. Cleanliness, privacy, and convenience became markers of elite status, reinforcing social boundaries through infrastructure. Vertical movement also became mechanized. Hydraulic elevators, originally developed for industrial use, were installed to spare owners the indignity of climbing stairs. These elevators were often hidden behind paneled doors or disguised within grand stair halls, ensuring that ease never disrupted aesthetic hierarchy. Servants, by contrast, used separate lifts or staircases, reinforcing class distinctions through circulation. Communication systems transformed household management. Call buttons, speaking tubes, and electric bells connected every major room to servant quarters. This network allowed for immediate response without visible labor. The ideal was effortlessness. Meals appeared, rooms adjusted, fires lit, all without the owner witnessing the work required. Power was defined by invisibility. Ventilation, refrigeration, and food storage were equally advanced. Ice houses, cold rooms, and early mechanical refrigeration allowed for elaborate menus and exotic ingredients year-round. Kitchens functioned as industrial operations, often isolated from the main house to control heat, noise, and smell. The dining room above was serene precisely because the labor below was hidden. These technological systems required constant maintenance and specialized staff. Engineers, electricians, and plumbers joined traditional domestic servants, expanding the workforce needed to sustain elite comfort. The mansion thus became a hybrid of palace and factory, an organism that consumed energy, labor, and resources at extraordinary rates. Critically, this hidden modernity revealed a contradiction. While owners publicly embraced tradition, lineage, and historical style, they privately depended on innovation to maintain their lifestyles. The mansion reconciled this tension by concealing technology, allowing modern power to operate behind antique surfaces. Progress was acceptable only when invisible. Today, these systems offer historians a crucial insight. They demonstrate that Gilded Age elites were not nostalgic reactionaries, but strategic modernists. They adopted technology aggressively, so long as it reinforced hierarchy and comfort rather than disrupting social order. Hidden technologies of luxury remind us that these mansions were not frozen relics of the past. They were cutting-edge environments designed to maximize control over space, time, labor, and experience. In the Gilded Age, true power was not loud, it was seamless. The grandeur of Gilded Age power mansions rested on a vast and meticulously organized system of human labor. While architecture and technology created the illusion of effortless luxury, this illusion was sustained by armies of servants whose presence was both essential and deliberately concealed. Power within the mansion was not only expressed through space and ornament, but through the careful management of visibility. Who was seen, who was heard, and who was meant to remain invisible. Large estates routinely employed between 30 and 100 servants, depending on season and social activity. These workers were arranged into rigid hierarchies that mirrored military or corporate structures. At the top were butlers, housekeepers, and stewards, who oversaw daily operations and mediated between the owners and staff. Below them were footmen, ladies' maids, valets, cooks, laundresses, chambermaids, grooms, gardeners, and stable hands. Each role was narrowly defined, reinforcing order and efficiency through specialization. Architecture enforced this hierarchy with precision. Servant staircases, corridors, and entrances were physically separated from formal spaces, ensuring that labor remained unseen. Entire networks of passageways allowed staff to circulate meals, clean rooms, and manage fires without crossing public sight lines. In some houses, servants could traverse the mansion from end to end without ever entering a formal room. This spatial invisibility was not accidental. It was fundamental to elite comfort. Servant quarters were typically confined to basements, attics, or detached wings. Rooms were small, sparsely furnished, and often shared. While the owners inhabited soaring spaces filled with light and ornament, Servants lived in compressed environments optimized for rest rather than pleasure. The contrast was stark and intentional. Spatial generosity was reserved for those who wielded power. Time discipline further structured servant life. Days began before dawn and ended late at night, particularly during social seasons. Meals were taken standing or in shifts, uniforms were mandatory, and behavior was strictly regulated. Silence, discretion, and loyalty were prized above all. A servant's value lay not only in competence but in their ability to disappear. Gender played a crucial role in labor organization. Male servants occupied public-facing roles, footmen, butlers, valets, where height, posture, and appearance reinforced prestige. Female servants performed the bulk of domestic labor behind the scenes, cleaning, laundering, cooking, and child care. This division reflected broader social norms, with masculinity aligned to display and femininity to maintenance. The mansion also functioned as a training ground for discipline and control. Many servants were immigrants or young rural workers, dependent on wages and housing provided by the household. Their economic vulnerability reinforced obedience. Dismissal often meant immediate displacement, making compliance a matter of survival. Despite this rigidity, servants possessed intimate knowledge of elite life. They witnessed private conversations, emotional breakdowns, and financial anxieties hidden from public view. This proximity created tension. Owners relied on servants' discretion while simultaneously fearing their awareness. Architectural separation and strict etiquette served to manage this risk. Critics of the Gilded Age increasingly focused on this invisible labor. Reformers argued that such households reproduced feudal systems within a democratic society. The mansion became a symbol not only of wealth, but of entrenched inequality maintained through architectural and social engineering. Today, the servant spaces preserved in historic mansions are among their most revealing features. Narrow staircases, worn floors, and cramped quarters tell a parallel story, one of endurance rather than excess. They remind us that Gilded Age luxury was never autonomous. It was manufactured daily through disciplined human effort. Servant hierarchies and invisible labor expose the true cost of grandeur. They reveal that power in the Gilded Age was not simply owned. It was constantly performed, maintained, and enforced by those whose presence was meant to vanish. Gilded Age power mansions were not gender-neutral environments. Their layouts, functions, and decorative programs encoded distinct roles for men and women, shaping how influence was exercised within elite households. While public narratives often centered on male industrialists, these mansions reveal a more complex distribution of power, one in which women wielded significant social authority through carefully designated spaces. Male-dominated rooms were typically inward-facing and solemn. Libraries, studies, smoking rooms, and billiard rooms were designed as zones of privacy and control. Heavy wood paneling, low lighting, and masculine iconography emphasized stability, intellect, and restraint. These rooms functioned as informal boardrooms where financial strategies were discussed, alliances forged, and decisions made away from public scrutiny. Access was restricted. To be invited into these spaces was to be recognized as an insider. Female-dominated spaces, by contrast, were outward-facing and performative. Drawing rooms, salons, morning rooms, and ballrooms were the arenas in which women exercised power. These rooms were lighter, more decorative, and socially flexible, designed to host conversation, music, and spectacle. Through guest lists, seating arrangements, and the orchestration of events, women shaped reputations, facilitated marriages, and controlled social access. Influence here was subtle but decisive. The ballroom was the ultimate expression of feminine social authority. Its scale and ornamentation communicated the household's status, but its success depended entirely on management. A poorly organized ball could damage a family's reputation, while a triumph could secure social dominance for an entire season. Mastery of etiquette, timing, and atmosphere transformed hospitality into a form of governance. Spatial separation reinforced these roles. Men could withdraw into private rooms to conduct business, while women remained visible, maintaining the household's public face. This division allowed male power to operate discreetly, while female power operated socially. Neither was incidental. Both were essential to maintaining elite status. Bedrooms and dressing rooms further illustrate this dynamic. Women's suites were often larger and more elaborately decorated than men's, reflecting the importance of appearance, presentation, and ritual. These spaces were not merely private. They were preparatory zones where identity was constructed before entering public rooms. Clothing, posture, and behavior were refined here with strategic intent. Servants reinforced gendered power structures. Ladies' maids and valets provided constant support, enabling elite men and women to perform their roles flawlessly. The labor required to maintain femininity, hair, clothing, cleanliness, was extensive, underscoring that elegance itself was a managed resource. Importantly, women's influence extended beyond the domestic sphere. By controlling social networks within the mansion, they indirectly shaped political and economic outcomes. Invitations could elevate careers, exclusion could isolate rivals. In this way, the home became a political space, with women acting as gatekeepers of access. However, this power was constrained. Women's authority depended on social success and marital status, making it precarious and vulnerable to scandal. The mansion offered influence but rarely autonomy. Architectural grandeur masked these limitations, presenting harmony where inequality persisted. Modern interpretations often underestimate this dimension of Gilded Age life. By focusing solely on male industrialists, they overlook how architecture enabled parallel systems of power. Gendered spaces were not simply reflections of social norms. They were tools that structured influence. Gilded Age mansions thus functioned as dual arenas of authority. Behind closed doors and beneath glittering chandeliers, power flowed along gendered lines, each reinforced by architecture, ritual, and expectation. To understand these houses fully is to recognize how influence was divided, performed, and negotiated within their walls. In the Gilded Age, wealth alone did not guarantee entry into elite society. Social legitimacy had to be granted, curated, and defended, and power mansions served as the primary arenas where this gatekeeping occurred. The most exclusive of these social circles coalesced around a loosely defined group known as the 400, a term that came to represent not just a list of names, but an entire system of controlled access. The phrase originated with Caroline Schermerhorn Astor, widely known as Mrs. Astor, whose ballroom could reportedly accommodate 400 guests. Whether literal or symbolic, the number captured the reality of elite social life. Inclusion was finite. The size of a ballroom, the length of a dining table, or the capacity of a drawing room imposed physical limits that translated into social ones. Architecture thus became an instrument of exclusion. Power mansions functioned as social filters. Invitations to dinners, balls, and receptions signaled acceptance. Absence signaled rejection. These events were carefully orchestrated performances in which guest lists were scrutinized with near-political precision. A single misplaced invitation could destabilize alliances or provoke public embarrassment. Social power lay in discretion, not generosity. Hostesses wielded extraordinary influence. Women like Mrs. Astor, Alva Vanderbilt, and their contemporaries determined who crossed the threshold into elite spaces. Their authority did not derive from law or capital, but from consensus and ritual. By controlling access to the most prestigious rooms in the city, they defined the boundaries of high society. A mansion, no matter how grand, was socially inert without the right guests. Architecture reinforced these distinctions. Entrance halls staged arrival, allowing hosts to observe and judge. Drawing rooms encouraged controlled interaction, while dining rooms enforced hierarchy through seating arrangements. Even staircases and corridors became social theaters where visibility mattered. To be seen ascending a grand stair or entering a ballroom at the right moment was to perform belonging. This gatekeeping extended across seasons and geographies. Newport, New York, Palm Beach, and Saratoga formed a circuit of elite residences, each with its own social calendar. Inclusion required constant performance. Failure to appear in the right place at the right time could erode status. Mansions were nodes in a network of power, not isolated fortresses. New money faced particular scrutiny. Industrial wealth challenged established social hierarchies, creating tension between inherited status and economic dominance. Some families built ever larger mansions to force acceptance. Others were deliberately ignored. The mansion became both a weapon and a test, proof of wealth, but not necessarily of refinement. Public fascination with the 400 amplified its power. Newspapers reported on guest lists, gowns, and decor, transforming private events into public spectacles. This visibility turned social exclusion into a form of soft punishment. To be omitted was not merely personal, it was reputational. Critics mocked this system as artificial and un-American, yet its effectiveness was undeniable. Social gatekeeping stabilized elite power by limiting access and reinforcing shared norms. It allowed a relatively small group to define taste, morality, and legitimacy for a much larger society. Over time, this exclusivity became unsustainable. Demographic change, economic shifts, and cultural democratization eroded the authority of social arbiters. Ballrooms emptied, mansions closed, and the rigid boundaries of the 400 dissolved. Yet for a brief, intense period, these power mansions functioned as private courts. Within their walls, social permission was granted or denied, shaping lives and legacies. The 400 was less a list than a spatial reality, one enforced by architecture, ritual, and the quiet authority of the closed door. While Gilded Age power mansions are often remembered for their extravagance and social spectacle, their most consequential functions frequently occurred out of sight. Behind paneled doors and beneath coffered ceilings, these residences served as informal centers of political negotiation and influence. In an era when the boundaries between business, government, and society were porous, the mansion became a critical site where private wealth intersected with public power. Formal political institutions existed, but they were often secondary to elite networks cultivated in domestic settings. Libraries, smoking rooms, and private dining rooms provided environments where candid discussion was possible without press scrutiny or public accountability. These spaces encouraged trust, discretion, and continuity, qualities essential for negotiating policy, securing contracts, and aligning interests across sectors. Industrialists and financiers hosted senators, cabinet members, judges, and foreign diplomats in their homes, blurring the line between hospitality and lobbying. A well-timed dinner could influence legislation. A weekend retreat could cement alliances. Unlike official meetings, these encounters carried no record, leaving historians to reconstruct their impact through correspondence and outcomes rather than transcripts. The architecture of these mansions facilitated political intimacy. Rooms were scaled to encourage conversation rather than debate, with seating arrangements that minimized hierarchy while reinforcing exclusivity. Heavy curtains, sound-dampening materials, and physical distance from the street insulated discussions from intrusion. Privacy was not incidental, it was designed. Political influence also flowed through social events. Balls, receptions, and charity functions brought together figures who might not meet in formal contexts. Casual encounters in drawing rooms or during house parties created opportunities for persuasion and alliance building. Women, often excluded from formal political power, exercised indirect influence by shaping guest lists and seating arrangements, controlling who interacted with whom. Regional power dynamics were reinforced through these domestic networks. Eastern industrialists hosted Western politicians. Financiers courted Southern leaders, and international guests were introduced to American power on elite terms. The mansion functioned as a diplomatic stage, projecting stability, refinement, and authority. To be received in such a home was to be acknowledged as politically relevant. This system was efficient but deeply controversial. Progressive reformers argued that private residences had become shadow governments, undermining democratic transparency. Investigative journalists exposed connections between legislation and elite hospitality, fueling public distrust. The mansion, once celebrated as a triumph of success, increasingly appeared as a site of undue influence. Yet defenders saw these interactions as natural extensions of leadership. They argued that effective governance required personal relationships and mutual understanding, conditions best fostered in private, comfortable settings. From this perspective, the mansion was not a threat to democracy, but a stabilizing force. The decline of this domestic political power mirrored broader changes. Regulatory frameworks, professional bureaucracies, and media scrutiny reduced the effectiveness of private influence. As fortunes fragmented and mansions disappeared, political power shifted toward institutions rather than individuals. Nevertheless, the legacy of these closed-door politics endures. Modern lobbying, private fundraising events, and elite retreats echo the patterns established in Gilded Age mansions. The spaces have changed, but the logic remains. Power prefers privacy. To understand the political history of the Gilded Age, one must look beyond Capitol buildings and campaign trails. Many of the era's most significant decisions were shaped in drawing rooms and libraries, within mansions designed not only to impress, but to influence. Gilded Age power was not fixed to a single location. It moved with the seasons, following climate, social calendars, and strategic opportunity. Elite families maintained multiple residences, not for leisure alone, but to remain continuously positioned within shifting centers of influence. This seasonal migration created a geographic network of power mansions that functioned together as an elite ecosystem. Winter belonged to New York City, where Fifth Avenue mansions placed families at the heart of finance, politics, and social arbitration. Proximity mattered. Being physically present allowed industrialists to monitor markets, host decision-makers, and participate in tightly scheduled social rituals. Absence risked irrelevance. The city mansion was the command center. Summer shifted power to resort enclaves such as Newport, Rhode Island, Bar Harbor, Maine, and Saratoga Springs. These locations offered respite from heat, but more importantly, they concentrated elites in semi-private environments where social boundaries could be enforced with ease. Newport in particular functioned as a seasonal court. Its mansions lined Bellevue Avenue like rival embassies, each hosting events designed to reaffirm hierarchy and allegiance. Autumn often meant retreats to country estates in the Hudson Valley, the Berkshires, or the Adirondacks. These landscapes supported a different mode of influence, intimate, masculine, and strategic. Hunting parties, fishing excursions, and extended house stays fostered trust and camaraderie among powerful men. Business decisions made in these settings carried the authority of personal loyalty rather than contractual obligation. Winter migration expanded southward as well. Palm Beach and later other warm weather destinations emerged as elite refugees, allowing power to operate year-round. These southern estates signaled not only comfort but adaptability. Control over multiple climates reinforced the impression that elite life was insulated from ordinary constraints. Architecture adapted to this migration. Seasonal mansions were specialized, lighter construction for summer, heavier for winter, open loggias versus enclosed halls, informal dining versus ceremonial rooms. Yet each residence maintained consistent symbolic language, ensuring continuity of identity across locations. Power traveled, but its image remained stable. This movement required immense logistical coordination. Furniture, wardrobes, servants, and even pets were transported between houses. Staff often preceded owners to prepare residences, ensuring seamless transitions. The ability to relocate without disruption became a mark of supremacy. Mobility itself was power. Social consequences were significant. Those unable to maintain multiple residences struggled to keep pace. Absence from key locations at critical times could lead to social and political marginalization. Seasonal migration thus reinforced inequality within the elite, favoring those with the resources to sustain constant visibility. Critics viewed this nomadic opulence as wasteful and unpatriotic. While much of the nation endured harsh working conditions, elites pursued perpetual comfort. The contrast intensified resentment and sharpened critiques of concentrated wealth. Over time, changes in transportation, communication, and work culture reduced the necessity of physical presence. Power became less seasonal, more institutional. Many of these secondary mansions were abandoned, sold, or demolished as their strategic value declined. Seasonal power migration reveals that Gilded Age authority was not only architectural, but geographic. To rule effectively, elites had to be everywhere that mattered, at exactly the right time. Their mansions were not isolated trophies, but stations in a carefully choreographed circuit of influence. The very qualities that made Gilded Age power mansions effective instruments of authority also rendered them deeply controversial. Their scale, visibility, and extravagance transformed private wealth into public spectacle, inviting scrutiny in a society increasingly aware of inequality. What began as assertions of legitimacy gradually became symbols of excess, fueling backlash that reshaped public opinion and policy. Initially, these mansions were celebrated as triumphs of progress. Newspapers marveled at their engineering, craftsmanship, and opulence, framing them as evidence of American success. Architectural tours and illustrated spreads turned private residences into aspirational icons. For a time, extravagance was equated with national achievement. This narrative shifted as economic volatility and labor unrest intensified. Strikes, wage disputes, and industrial accidents highlighted the human cost of wealth accumulation. Against this backdrop, mansions appeared less as rewards for innovation and more as monuments to imbalance. Journalists and reformers juxtaposed images of gilded ballrooms with crowded tenements, transforming architecture into evidence. The rise of muckraking journalism amplified this critique. Writers exposed connections between industrial fortunes and monopolistic practices, political corruption, and worker exploitation. Mansions featured prominently in these accounts, serving as visual shorthand for systemic injustice. Their very permanence made them ideal targets, fixed, photographable, and emotionally resonant. Public tours, once celebratory, took on an accusatory tone. Visitors marveled but also questioned. Why so much? For whom? The mansion became a rhetorical device in debates over taxation, regulation, and labor rights. Its grandeur could no longer be isolated from its context. Architectural excess also provoked cultural critique. Intellectuals and artists mocked the imitation of European aristocracy, portraying it as insecure and un-American. The charge was not merely economic but moral. These houses represented a retreat from civic responsibility into private splendor. Political consequences followed. Progressive-era reforms targeted concentrated wealth through income taxes, inheritance taxes, and corporate regulation. While not aimed solely at mansions, these policies undermined the financial structures that sustained them. Large estates became increasingly expensive to maintain and pass on, accelerating their decline. Some elites responded by embracing philanthropy, attempting to offset criticism through public good. Libraries, universities, and museums were endowed, often with architectural grandeur rivaling private homes. This shift redirected monumental building from private to public realms, altering the landscape of power. Yet the backlash never fully erased admiration. Mansions remained objects of fascination, their beauty complicating moral judgment. This tension, between critique and allure, defined their cultural afterlife. Excess versus backlash reveals the limits of architectural power. Visibility, once an asset, became a vulnerability. What could not be hidden could not be defended indefinitely. The fate of these mansions illustrates a broader lesson of the Gilded Age. Power that insists on display must eventually answer for itself. In transforming wealth into architecture, elites created enduring symbols. But symbols are subject to reinterpretation. When values shift, stone and marble cannot adapt. The fall of Gilded Age power mansions was often as swift and dramatic as their rise. Built to project permanence, many of these estates proved ill-suited to the economic, social, and cultural realities of the 20th century. Within a generation, houses conceived as dynastic anchors became burdens, financially unsustainable, socially obsolete, and politically fraught. One of the primary forces behind this decline was taxation. The introduction of progressive income taxes and steep inheritance taxes fundamentally altered the economics of extreme wealth. Estates that had been easy to build became nearly impossible to maintain or transfer intact. Heirs faced crushing costs simply to keep the lights on, let alone staff and repair vast structures designed for a vanished lifestyle. Social change compounded these pressures. The elaborate rituals that justified such architecture, formal dinners, balls, and large domestic staffs, lost relevance. Fewer families employed dozens of servants, and social life became less centralized in private homes. Rooms built for spectacle sat unused, their scale increasingly impractical. Maintenance itself became a form of attrition. Imported materials required specialized care. Aging systems demanded constant investment. Deferred repairs accumulated, accelerating deterioration. Without the original fortunes that funded them, these houses decayed quickly. Neglect transformed grandeur into liability. Urban transformation was particularly ruthless. Fifth Avenue mansions, once the epicenter of elite life, were demolished to make way for commercial buildings and apartments. Land values outpaced sentimental attachment. In city after city, entire streets of mansions vanished within decades, erased not by catastrophe, but by calculation. Rural and resort estates fared little better. Seasonal homes lost their strategic value as transportation and communication reduced the need for geographic presence. Some were abandoned, others sold piecemeal, their contents auctioned off. Once cohesive estates were fragmented into real estate commodities. Cultural attitudes also shifted. The public, increasingly critical of inherited privilege, viewed these houses as relics of excess. Preservation was not yet a widespread priority, and demolition was often celebrated as progress. Loss was rarely mourned until it was irreversible. Yet decline was uneven. Some mansions survived through adaptation, converted into schools, museums, hotels, or institutional headquarters. These transformations preserved physical structures while stripping them of private power. The mansion became a shell, its authority redistributed. The psychological impact of this decline was profound. For families who had built these houses as symbols of endurance, their loss represented not just financial change, but the end of a worldview. Architecture had promised permanence. Reality delivered impermanence. Today, the absence of these mansions is itself a historical fact. Empty lots, altered streetscapes, and surviving photographs testify to a vanished urban fabric. What remains shapes how we remember the Gilded Age, less through what stands than through what has been lost. Decline, abandonment, and demolition reveal the ultimate fragility of architectural power. No matter how monumental, buildings are subject to forces beyond design, policy, culture, economics, and memory. The Gilded Age mansion was built to defy time. Time inevitably answered back. While many Gilded Age power mansions disappeared, others survived by shedding their original purpose. Reinvention became the only viable path forward. These buildings endured not because their private power remained intact, but because they proved adaptable, capable of being absorbed into new institutional, cultural, and economic frameworks. The most common transformation was into museums. As private wealth fragmented and heirs retreated from monumental living, preservationists and civic leaders recognized the educational and symbolic value of these estates. Former power mansions became curated environments where the public could encounter craftsmanship, art, and social history once reserved for the elite. Authority shifted from ownership to interpretation. Universities and schools offered another lifeline. Large estates were well suited to institutional use. Expansive rooms became lecture halls, libraries, or administrative offices. Servant wings converted into dormitories. In this context, architecture once designed to reinforce hierarchy was repurposed to support knowledge production. Power was reframed as cultural capital. Some mansions found second lives as hotels and event venues. Their scale and ornamentation lent themselves naturally to luxury hospitality. Guests could temporarily inhabit spaces of former privilege, consuming history as experience. This commercialization preserved buildings physically while transforming their meaning. Grandeur became a service rather than a statement. Government and diplomatic use provided another form of survival. Embassies, consulates, and official residences adopted these mansions to project continuity and prestige. Here, private authority was replaced by state symbolism. The architecture retained its representational function, but allegiance shifted from family to nation. Religious and nonprofit institutions also played a role. Converted into retreat centers, headquarters, or cultural foundations, mansions were stripped of exclusivity while retaining aesthetic power. These uses softened public resentment, recasting former excess as communal benefit. Reinvention required compromise. Subdivision, accessibility modifications, and modern infrastructure altered original layouts. Ballrooms lost intimacy, bedrooms lost privacy. Yet these changes ensured relevance. Preservation without use proved unsustainable. Importantly, survival was selective. Only the most architecturally distinguished or strategically located mansions were saved. Reinvention thus introduced a new hierarchy, one based on cultural value rather than economic might. These adapted estates reveal a critical shift. Power no longer resided in ownership, but in narrative. Who tells the story, who curates the space, and who gains access now determines significance. Survival through reinvention demonstrates that architecture can outlive ideology. While the social systems that created Gilded Age mansions collapsed, the buildings themselves, when repurposed, found new roles. They no longer dominate society, but they continued to shape memory. While many Gilded Age power mansions disappeared, others survived by shedding their original purpose. Reinvention became the only viable path forward. These buildings endured not because their private power remained intact, but because they proved adaptable, capable of being absorbed into new institutional, cultural, and economic frameworks. The most common transformation was into museums. As private wealth fragmented and heirs retreated from monumental living, preservationists and civic leaders recognized the educational and symbolic value of these estates. Former power mansions became curated environments where the public could encounter craftsmanship, art, and social history once reserved for the elite. Authority shifted from ownership to interpretation. Universities and schools offered another lifeline. Large estates were well suited to institutional use. Expansive rooms became lecture halls, libraries, or administrative offices. Servant wings converted into dormitories. In this context, architecture once designed to reinforce hierarchy was repurposed to support knowledge production. Power was reframed as cultural capital. Some mansions found second lives as hotels and event venues. Their scale and ornamentation lent themselves naturally to luxury hospitality. Guests could temporarily inhabit spaces of former privilege, consuming history as experience. This commercialization preserved buildings physically while transforming their meaning. Grandeur became a service rather than a statement. Government and diplomatic use provided another form of survival. Embassies, consulates, and official residences adopted these mansions to project continuity and prestige. Here, private authority was replaced by state symbolism. The architecture retained its representational function, but allegiance shifted from family to nation. Religious and nonprofit institutions also played a role. Converted into retreat centers, headquarters, or cultural foundations, mansions were stripped of exclusivity while retaining aesthetic power. These uses softened public resentment, recasting former excess as communal benefit. Reinvention required compromise. Subdivision, accessibility modifications, and modern infrastructure altered original layouts. Ballrooms lost intimacy, bedrooms lost privacy. Yet these changes ensured relevance. Preservation without use proved unsustainable. Importantly, survival was selective. Only the most architecturally distinguished or strategically located mansions were saved. Reinvention thus introduced a new hierarchy, one based on cultural value rather than economic might. These adapted estates reveal a critical shift. Power no longer resided in ownership, but in narrative. Who tells the story, who curates the space, and who gains access now determines significance. Survival through reinvention demonstrates that architecture can outlive ideology. While the social systems that created Gilded Age mansions collapsed, the buildings themselves, when repurposed, found new roles. They no longer dominate society, but they continued to shape memory. The Gilded Age power mansion was built to outlast time, to freeze authority in stone and marble, to make wealth appear inevitable. Its walls promised permanence in a nation defined by change. For a brief moment, they succeeded. These houses ruled their streets, their cities, and the imaginations of a society watching power take physical form. But architecture, no matter how grand, cannot control history. The systems that created these mansions, unchecked industry, concentrated wealth, rigid hierarchy, were challenged, reformed, and in many cases dismantled. Some houses vanished entirely, erased by progress and policy. Others survived by surrendering their original purpose, opening their doors to the public, their power transformed into memory. What remains is not simply beauty or excess, but a record. These mansions tell us how power wants to be seen, how it organizes space, how it hides labor, and how it defends itself against uncertainty. They remind us that every age builds monuments not just to success, but to its own anxieties. Today's landscapes of wealth look different, but the impulse is unchanged. Power still seeks walls, distance, and spectacle. The question is not whether we will build monuments, but what they will say about us when their meaning is rewritten. The Gilded Age mansion no longer commands. It endures, and in its endurance, it asks us to look more closely at who built it, who sustained it, and what, in the end, it was really built to protect.